When the Beatles burst onto the world stage in 1963, they transformed popular music overnight. A commercial phenomenon like no other, they paved the way for every artist who followed in their wake.
They were selling vast amounts of records, a 250,000 a week. No one has ever done that before. You know, Elvis had them, Lonnie Donegan had them, every week selling 250,000 records.
You had a revolution just in terms of sales. But in addition to that, we wouldn't have had the Rolling Stones. You wouldn't have had the Byrds, you wouldn't have had Dylan going electric, you wouldn't have had the Doors, and all those other bands that we associate also with the 60s. The chances of them existing without the Beatles are pretty slim.
Yet the band's impact spread far beyond music. As figureheads for a blooming youth culture, their influence penetrated to the heart of the post-war world.
They were agents of change. They were carrying everyone with them. Everything felt modern, new, fresh. Everywhere you looked, the world started to look different. The colors started to really emerge, the green shoots of a new culture.
From the point of the Beatles' arrival, they completely reinvented how culture works. Suddenly, adults were growing their hair long. Grown-up women were wearing mini skirts. Suddenly, it was young people who were determining everything. That started with the Beatles.
By the second half of the 60s, the band transformed into leaders of the emerging counterculture. Bringing new social, sexual, and artistic ideas into the mainstream, through their peaceful revolution, they became the undisputed voice of a generation.
The Beatles were the most commercial band on earth, but they were also the most avant-garde and experimental. That was their role. Through their music, they opened up people's minds.
They helped to move a lot of people who might not otherwise have gone along with the stuff that happened in 66 and 67 and 68. They were inspirational and influential in that way. But as they became more involved in the counterculture and more representative of it, they became a political threat.
This film traces the Beatles' path through the most extraordinary decade of the 20th century. It reveals the lasting impact of four musicians from Liverpool who went from class warriors to cultural revolutionaries while providing the soundtrack for a generation.
They were a catalyst for a great many things. They changed just about everything.
Great Britain, 1962. A small and once dominant kingdom finally recovering from years of austerity following the Second World War. A nation of discipline and order, of industrial cities and quiet village greens. And although outwardly it appeared stuck in the past, beneath the surface a fresh culture was developing that would rapidly transform it. At the close of the year, the UK was hit by some of the coldest weather it had ever suffered. Everyday life grinding to a halt as snow covered the country. Breaking through this bitter winter, on January the 11th, 1963, a record was issued that provided the first glimpse of the brave new world that was to come. Please Please Me, the second single by Liverpudlian four-piece The Beatles, quickly rose to number 2 on the British charts, and its mainstream success announced the arrival of a revolutionary force in both music and culture.
You don't need me to show why do I always have to say that? Come on, 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 please, please me, oh yeah, I got please you.
Please Please Me was a kind of an eruption. They took the blunt force of 1950s rock and roll, which was a blunt instrument. There's no other way to describe it. Musically and socially, it was a blunt instrument. And they grafted onto that the harmonies and the whole sort of plaintive vocal quality of the girl groups of the early 1960s. Nobody had ever heard anything quite like this before. This was a group that had two of the best singers of their era in the same group. And something like that, I don't think had really happened before. The sound of John Lennon and Paul McCartney singing together is one of the great sounds in music of the 20th century.
Last night I said I know you never even tried.
They were a shock to the system. Love Me Do was the first single, and it was a bit of a false start. Please Please Me, it's when you had the unison sound of the band. They're singing, come on, come on. There's this sense of anticipation and a sense of excitement. It was a fresh sound. I mean, it sounds so traditional now, but at the time, the look and the sound was completely fresh. It was positive, uplifting, and modern.
The Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, provided a much-needed shot in the arm to Britain's pop scene. Although American rock and roll had been enormously popular in the mid-1950s, its electrifying initial surge proved short-lived. With its major stars either selling out or disappearing from the scene, the musicians that came in their wake were more wholesome and less threatening. British artists followed suit, and the musical landscape in the UK was dominated by talented imitators and the teen idols of pop Svengali Larry Parnes. With the support of their manager Brian Epstein and producer George Martin, the Beatles offered something very different. Driven by the unique songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, this band composed their own material.
Most of conventional English show business, as we think of it, was really a pale reflection of American show business. It had not always been the case, but since the war, certainly it was. You had singers like Matt Monro, who did an almost letter-perfect imitation of Frank Sinatra. By the same token, you had the famous, facile, fatuous English pop stars of the period, of whom Cliff Richard was by far the best known and most successful, who was a kind of third-rate version of Elvis, and not of the Elvis of Heartbreak Hotel, but of the Elvis of King Creole, the Elvis of Elvis the movie star.
We're all going on a summer holiday. No more working for a week or two. Fun and laughter on a summer holiday. No more worries for me or you for a week or two.
It was pretty professional. Cliff Richard and the Shadows were good players. It was a good act, but it was family friendly. And you had also characters like Larry Parnes with his stable of pretty boys who did what they were told, who sung what they were told to sing, and who had no particular creative input at all. So when somebody like the Beatles comes along, and they're not only playing their own instruments, singing beautifully, they're also singing their own compositions. This was incredibly rare at the time.
The Beatles were keen from the start to write their own material. They wrote the songs to the audience, to address the audience. They knew that the audience was 80% teenage girls, and they wrote songs that elicited the perfect response from them. And after that, the deluge followed. It sent the signal out to everybody that you can all write your own song, get a slice of the action. Within a year or two, all bands are writing or having a crack at it.
It wasn't only the extraordinary sound of the Beatles or the unique talents of Lennon and McCartney that were revolutionizing popular music. As they came to dominate the charts in 1963, their string of hit records transformed the commercial fortunes of the British record industry itself.
As the Beatles became more popular and every record seemed to sell more and more, you had a revolution in the British record industry, just in terms of sales. They'd never seen anything like this, both in the amount of sales and how long the Beatles would hang around in the charts for months and months and months. In addition to that, there was the rolling impact of hit after hit after hit that never let the quality drop. If anything, the quality increased from Please Please Me to From Me to You, which was a little more downbeat but was no less wily, and then Between the Eyes, She Loves You, which explodes out of the radio to this day.
lost your love when I saw her yesterday.
People like Cliff and Billy Fury and Elvis, they were selling quite substantial amounts of records, per se. But by beginning of 1963, Please Please Me and From Me to You and the Please Please Me album, they were selling vast amounts of records.
No one's seen anything like this in the pop industry before. I mean, this was suddenly a happening industry that not only young people were taking notice of it, but the bean counters too. So you had everyone scouring Birmingham for the Moody Blues, the Hollies in Manchester, and Liverpool, of course. All the scouts were up there looking for the next Beatles. Everyone wanted a slice of the action because they'd revolutionised the music industry in just a matter of months in 1963.
But the group's impact was not merely confined to the musical world. They also both represented and inspired a seismic shift at the very heart of British society. How these four young working-class Liverpudlians managed to spearhead such a change lie in the Beatles and the country's past. In the 2 centuries before the Second World War, the United Kingdom had led the Industrial Revolution and had ruled over the greatest empire on earth. One of the foundations behind this superpower was its class system, which both divided and ordered its citizens. After emerging victorious from war in 1945, the elite class in this system, known as the establishment, which included the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the heads of all the major institutions governing society, immediately tried to reinforce their power. And this chain of command would once again shape life in Britain during the post-war years.
Britain was a very class-ridden society. We are a nation of subjects, not citizens. And as long as you do have a royal family and a set of lords and ladies and the whole hierarchy of privilege, then obviously someone is going to be at the bottom. After the war, the establishment obviously tried to reassert itself. So you still had the old sort of Christian values, for instance. Nothing happened on a Sunday. Even children's swings in the parks were chained up on Sundays. The 60s really was the first time that anyone really kicked a hole in any of that and started to challenge all of these traditional assumptions. Really, it was the same group of middle-class people who assumed that they had the right to tell everybody how to live. We're still very much in power.
Yet Britain's power was waning, and its empire slowly crumbling. Almost bankrupt as a result of its war effort, the years of hardship that followed saw the entire country suffer. The north of England in particular struggled to recover, and the once dominant port city of Liverpool, heavily targeted by German air raids, was beset by widespread damage and disappearing industry.
During the 19th century, the North sort of developed this kind of proud sense of itself. The port of Liverpool was the greatest port in the world because England was the greatest commercial nation in the world, and everything, or most things, came in and out there. But over the course of the 20th century, England went through a phenomenon that is now very familiar to Americans of the late 20th century, which is the decline of industrialization, the decline of manufacturing. By the 1940s, it was very clear that Liverpool was in decline. As a result, the Beatles generation grew up in this place that was filled with the emblems of imperial might, but which was becoming a very dire place to live in many ways.
Everywhere there was a debris. The street was full of bomb buildings. All the kids used to play in the buildings and deserted places. The debris was still going 20 or 30 years later, you know. There was no money about, and it was very hard. What did young people have in Liverpool to look forward to? Everything was closing down. All the factories were closing down. It was pretty tough times in Liverpool in those days.
And it was within this stark landscape that the Beatles grew up. The band's founder and eldest member, John Lennon, was the product of a broken home and was raised by his aunt and uncle in a fairly affluent area of the city. His future bandmates, Paul McCartney and George Harrison, however, both came from working-class neighborhoods. Despite the dereliction surrounding them and the hard times in which they were raised, the future prospects of all three were given a boost by a new educational initiative, that saw the brightest children enrolled in grammar schools, whatever their financial background.
John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison took an examination when they were 11 years old that essentially certified them as clever. And as a result of passing what was called the 11+ exam, that meant that they were eligible to go to grammar schools. Grammar schools were designed to educate children in order to go on to some form of higher education. What this meant was that at a relatively early age, at the age of 11, particularly Paul McCartney and George Harrison, whose origins were truly working class. John Lennon was a bit more complicated. John was a little betwixt and between. But in the case of both Paul McCartney and George Harrison, at the age of 11, they were somewhat isolated from the world of the housing estates that they had grown up on. Every day they took the bus into the center of Liverpool to go to a place called the Liverpool Institute. And they were essentially marked and educated from the age of 11 to transcend their working class origins.
With far better schooling than their parents, these future Beatles were a new breed, raised within the proud Liverpudlian working class, yet unfazed by the educated elite supposedly above them. And with the coming of rock and roll in 1956, a musical form exploded that spoke directly to their youth and their sense of difference. It was the following year that John Lennon met Paul McCartney and invited him to join his band, the Quarrymen, with George Harrison joining shortly thereafter. All around them in Liverpool, a new phenomenon was finding its own rebellious voice. The teenagers had arrived.
The 50s became the era when teenagers really came into their own. We were together in our love of the music. Up until that time, a young lad would be taken to the pub for his first pint when he turned of age by his dad. He'd dress like his dad. He'd go into the union of his dad and go in the same work as his dad. With the girl, she was in the kitchen learning how to make the breakfast, do the cleaning, all the rest of it. But suddenly, the youngsters were now earning money and they wanted to spend it their way and do their things and not be told what to do.
A generation gap was opening up, and this would dominate cultural life in Britain across the next decade. And while rock and roll resonated with young working class Britons, other American influences, from the beat poets to jazz and blues, were embraced by middle class teenagers. If the future Beatles were at heart rock and roll rebels, none of them more embodied this than John Lennon. But having failed his exams in 1957, he found a place at the Liverpool College of Art, where he was thrown into an unfamiliar bohemian student culture. Although this would prove vital in expanding his talents, here Lennon was an outsider.
I first met John Lennon at the College of Art. I was sitting down in the sort of canteen, and suddenly I noticed this guy walk past. And I thought, what he dressed up like? Because he was dressed almost like a teddy boy and a completely unconventional type of dress compared to all the other students. And I looked around and everyone was wearing duffel coats and turtleneck sweaters. I thought, oh, they're all wearing the same, they're all conventional. He's the rebel, he's the one who's different, I must get to know him.
If you were in art school in the 1950s, you would have been exposed to the intellectual radicalism and rebellion of figures like Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation, who were anti-established religion, pro-self-expression, anti any kind of establishment repression. And the angry young men of theatre, John Osborne, Arnold Wesker, these guys were angry, but they were clever. They found a way of directing their anger, which may well have been a kind of personal angst, but when it's directed to the outside world, it can create a great articulate voice of a generation, if you like.
954. 950 bloody 5. I could get through in half the time if I went like a bull, but they'd only slash me wages so they can get stuffed. Don't let the bastards grind you down, that's one thing I've learned.
This sort of influence would have been very appealing to someone like John Lennon, who was himself an angry young man for all kinds of personal reasons. But if you could be an angry young man and thoughtful with it, then that's very appealing.
By the summer of 1960, the school days of John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were over, yet they were quickly thrust into an education of another kind. In August, the band, now calling itself the Beatles, headed for a season of shows in the vibrant German city Hamburg. And over the following year, it was here that they earned their stripes as a rock and roll band. Upon their return to Liverpool in 1961, they quickly rose to the very top of the city's music scene. Yet they were isolated in the north, and the rest of the country paid little attention.
I started writing to papers like the Daily Mail saying, what is happening in Liverpool is like New Orleans at the turn of the century, but with rock and roll instead of jazz. But of course, no one was interested. So I decided to do it myself and created Merseybeat. And of course, my friends, John and the group he formed, the Beatles, were the main people I wrote about.
With a teenage audience hungry for information about this new rock and roll scene, Bill Harry's Merseybeat music paper proved a huge success in the north of England. Celebrating the Beatles in almost every issue, it brought them to the attention of one of its contributors, local businessman Brian Epstein. The manager of a Liverpool music store, through Bill Harry, Epstein arranged to see the band play at the city's legendary Cavern Club and was blown away by their performance. He immediately offered to manage the band, and by January 1962, a contract was signed. Wary of the controlling approach of managers like Larry Parnes, Epstein was still conscious of the unwritten rules of the British entertainment industry. If the Beatles were going to change the world, they'd first have to change their look.
What I think he had was the instinct to realize the general overall sort of pattern of how things worked in this country. They were the savage young Beatles dressed in black leather and playing rock and roll to prostitutes, gangsters and all the rest of it in Hamburg, taking drugs and all the rest of it. They were the savage young Beatles. They would never have been accepted by the established media.
And the Beatles' breakthrough in early 1963 confirmed that Epstein's instincts were spot on. He had successfully smuggled a unique band of rebels into the heart of the mainstream. Yet unlike the controlling managers that dominated the British entertainment world, he then simply set them loose. From the moment they soared to the top of the British charts, the press, radio interviewers and television presenters came face to face with the Beatles. And these quick-witted, confident and very modern young men chose to play the game by their own rules.
In the beginning, the Beatles' behavior with the press was the most revolutionary thing about it. Nobody of their age group, and to a certain extent of their background, had ever behaved this way with reporters before.
Do you know you look like Matt Monro?
Give us a Russia with love.
Thanks, boys.
The Beatles were just audacious. When they were being interviewed, they kind of turned the tables. When Adam Faith or someone like that was interviewed before, it was very much, you know, kind of a master and servant kind of thing.
Cliff, what sort of tour did you have?
Oh, well, I can honestly say it's been probably the most pleasurable one we've had for some time, mainly because not just the audiences, but because we've had a few hours off and we've been swimming and sunbathing and things.
The Beatles just ripped into that and almost ridiculed the whole thing, turned the whole thing into a Marx Brothers farce, which was fantastic.
I hear anyway that the four of you are going to be millionaires by the end of the year.
Oh, that's nice.
Have you got time? Have you got time to actually spend this money?
What money? He said.
Doesn't he give any to you?
No. Can you see that car of his?
It was very, very close to the way groups of male adolescents interacted with one another as a matter of course. This is what teenage boys and do. They try to top one another. They try to cut one another down, all of this sort of thing. The Beatles simply had the nerve to take this thing and to sort of perform it in front of microphones and cameras.
John, there's a rumour in the news of the Beatles paper that you might be leaving the group.
Rubbish. I'm
Absolute
contracted. Been trying to get out for years.
You've been writing some poetry.
What paper?
A paper called The News of the Beatles.
Never heard of it.
Do you want to see it?
No.
Must be American.
Part of their success came from the fact that they were not plastic, they were authentic. They came out of a fairly tough city, and they were just being themselves, and that was astonishingly, that was new. To actually be yourself was new.
By presenting themselves genuinely, the Beatles managed to highlight the mannered, stilted exterior of British cultural life at a time when it was already showing signs of weakness. Polite society's attitude to all forms of behavior, in particular sex, had been prudish and stuffy for centuries. But by the early 1960s, things were changing. At the beginning of the decade, the novel Lady Chatterley's Lover was successfully published. Withheld from the general public since the late 1920s, this erotic tale of love across the class divide became a phenomenon upon its release, quickly selling over 3 million copies. At the same time, a scandal erupted at the very heart of the British establishment, with the exposure of an illicit affair between politician John Profumo and a 19-year-old model. The uptight sexual attitudes of the British were being confronted in public, and then Beatlemania happened. By the summer of 1963, the band's overwhelming effect on teenage girls was becoming a nationwide epidemic. Their critics warned that the Liverpudlians had unleashed a wave of sexual frenzy in their female audience. Yet the liberation that the Beatles offered these girls was more complicated than it first appeared.
What everybody wanted to think and also didn't want to think was this was somehow all about eroticism. This was all about sex. And what was going on here was that these young women were having something that looked like it simulated a sexual experience in response to the sight and sound of the Beatles. And therefore it was always talked about and written about in the Freudian terms of hysteria, which of course is a sexually charged term also. Were these girls orgasmic? Was this orgasmic? That's not what was going on.
With rock and roll in the 1950s, that was a catalyst for a lot of young men finding a reason to be something other than a version of their dad when they became adolescents. And it wasn't necessarily fabulously articulate to dress as a teddy boy and be a bit rowdy on the street, but at least it was finding an identity. And I think for a young female, it wasn't quite as straightforward. Something like Beatlemania, the screaming that surrounded the Beatles, it's quite tempting to interpret it as a sort of howl of frustration as they try and find their own identity. And it's as inarticulate in a way as teddy boys rampaging in cinemas.
Do you deliberately try and create these sort of screaming reactions?
No, we just, arrive at the theatre and they're always there waiting. And whenever we're doing a show, the police always come and say, don't look out the window, because you excite them.
These girls were controlling public space, and nobody could do anything about it. It's a perfect example of what we would call bad behavior. Screaming, yelling, weeping in public, this is bad behavior in one way or another. And yet it was sanctioned, not by the authorities, but by the Beatles themselves.
The Beatles phenomenon was unstoppable. At the end of August, the single She Loves You became the fastest-selling record that had ever been released in the UK. In less than a year, the band's success outstripped that of any artist who had preceded them. And the final stage in their conquest of Britain came on November the 4th, 1963, when for the first time the Beatles came face to face with the highest order of the establishment, the royal family. The occasion unleashed the rock and roll rebel in John Lennon, who saw in the night's performance an opportunity too good to pass up.
John, in this royal variety show, when you're appearing before royalty, your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted Heath saying that he couldn't distinguish.
I can't understand
the
Teddy.
Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
But you're not going to change your act just for the Lord Privy Seal.
Oh, no, we'll keep, the same kind of thing, won't we?
Oh, well,
yeah, that's right.
Lennon always had an ambivalent relationship with how the establishment, the entertainment establishment, were cozying up to the Beatles. On the one hand, the professional in him loved the fact that they were being fantastically successful, but the rebel in him found it all hard to take. And so on the occasion of the Royal Command performance, he teased Brian Epstein by suggesting that he was going to go up and swear in front of the Queen. But in the end, his professionalism won out. He managed to create a little bit of subversion, but it was very carefully thought through.
For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. Would the people in the cheaper seats clap your hands? And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewelry.
This is sort of like a moment of insurrection, it felt like. But the thing is, it wasn't quite as radical, perhaps, because you look at Lennon's face after he says it, and he sort of looks as if he's just admitted to his mum that he's messed himself, or something like that. It was something really humble pie. You know, he felt quite sheepish. But no one else but John Lennon would really come out and even have the gall to say that. But what may have seemed a kind of a revolutionary, insurrectionary moment by saying, rattle your jewelry, in a really class-driven moment, was actually punctured by this sense that the Beatles were nice boys and they can get away with anything.
With the youth of Britain in their thrall, the Beatles headed out to new territories, travelling to Scandinavia at the close of the year and then on to France. The domestic pop scene that they left behind had been transformed by their success. And from Liverpudlian acts like Jerry and the Pacemakers to London's The Rolling Stones, new groups were emerging on an almost weekly basis to battle it out in the clubs and on the charts. The Beatles were moving on, however, with manager Brian Epstein's sights set firmly on the largest territory of all, America.
Looking forward to this American trip. Have you had any reaction over there? You got any fan clubs going? Is there
Well, there's one supposed to be started, and they're getting quite good response, you know. Yeah. 12,000 letters a day.
But the Beatle movement's going over there.
Yeah, you can even be a Beatle booster, folks.
Yeah. I must tell you, by the way, that Detroit University have got to stamp out the Beatle movement.
No.
We've got to stamp out Detroit. They think they think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
There was always that thing, well, what happens next? Is the beat bubble going to burst, you know? Yeah. But it never did, it just kept going on.
If Britain was suffering a particularly harsh winter when the Beatles had first set the charts alight in early 1963, when their single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, reached America the following year, it entered a nation grappling with far greater misfortunes. Having emerged from the Second World War as one of the world's two superpowers, the following decade had been dominated by the country's hostile relationship with the Soviet Union and the threat of a full-blown nuclear war. But Americans themselves were enjoying the fruits of a flourishing economy. A strong consumer culture had developed, and domestic confidence was running high. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy came to office, a young, charismatic politician who embodied this new confidence and who promised a bright and optimistic future.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
3 years later, in November 1963, his assassination shook the country to its core.
There was this injection of energy into American life that he represented. You know, he was young, he was handsome. It represented such a marked change from Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, Eisenhower was a carryover from World War II. Obviously, he was a war hero. He was an extension of that generation into modern America. But John Kennedy was modern America. All of the optimism and youthfulness, the baby boom was going on, you know, was kind of epitomized by John Kennedy. And the Kennedy assassination just ended that. The Beatles represented also youth, just as John Kennedy did, and wit and intelligence. Certainly for young people, it turned things around immediately. The Beatles just lit America up.
I'm sure it could have been something else. I mean, I'm sure that some other joyful manifestation of something could have occurred. But what occurred was a song. And it's really important to realize in Britain, the Beatles' personalities, their repartee, their whole public performance was a critical part of the way that they came to the attention of the British public. In America, it was a song.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something. I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand.
It was the perfect vehicle to come into this traumatized national atmosphere. What is a dominant quality of the sound of John Lennon and Paul McCartney singing together? Joy. Joy in performance. Joy in listening to one another's voices. Joy in whatever kind of reinforcement is going on here. That's painting with really broad strokes. There's nothing subtle about that.
There is no question the Beatles changed everything immediately. And I Want to Hold Your Hand made a gigantic impact. And then, of course, I mean, the floodgates opened. And not only with one great Beatles song after another, but, you know, the British invasion. I mean, the Beatles just knocked the door down.
What the Beatles had done to Britain, they were now doing to America. Released at the close of 1963, within 2 months, I Want to Hold Your Hand had sold more than 1 million copies and became the band's first #1 single in the US. A week after they topped the charts, John, Paul, George and Ringo crossed the Atlantic and arrived in New York City to greet a new set of screaming teenage fans. They were also met by members of the press keen to understand this foreign phenomenon, and the group introduced them to their unique brand of informal humor, as rare in America as it had been in Britain.
There's no question that the way they dealt with the press was original. It was quite clear that they were not like anything else. How smart they really were, how funny they were. I mean, John and Paul in particular were extremely intelligent, articulate, original people. And George was also a very droll guy, and Ringo was sort of a natural clown who was just that quick, that smart, who was a pop star. I mean, I must be forgetting somebody, but damned if I can think of who it would be.
You think of your records as funny records?
No, we think that it's funny and peculiar that they should be hits after such a long time.
Do you feel they're musical?
Obviously they're musical because it's music, isn't it? You know, instruments make music, and it's a record, even
It's musical.
Classical. Musical.
It's music, isn't it?
That's music.
It's good. He knows music.
All right, but what do you call it? Do you call it Boston rock and roll?
We don't. We try not to define it because we get so many wrong classifications of it. It's no use. We just call it music. Even if you don't.
With a question mark.
Pardon?
With a question mark?
No, we need
the
physics.
With an exclamation mark.
The underlying message of the Beatles' wit in their press conferences was about a youth movement that wasn't going to be determined by old people. From the point of the Beatles' arrival, they completely reinvented how culture works. Before that, everything, fashion, movies, music, it all was top down. It all was, what grown-ups liked, and then it filtered down to the kids. After a year or two, suddenly it was young people who were determining everything. That started with the Beatles.
Having broken all previous sales records in Britain the year beforehand, by April 1964, the band made Billboard Hot 100 history by becoming the only act ever to occupy the first 5 positions on the chart. The 4 Mop Tops were now revolutionizing popular music in America too, and Beatlemania spread like wildfire throughout the country. And then in July, following the time-honored career trajectory of all post-war popular entertainers, the band starred in their first full-length feature film. Yet A Hard Day's Night was, unsurprisingly, unlike anything that had preceded it.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night. I should be
Music movies before A Hard Day's Night were profit-making ventures intended exclusively for the teen audience of, whatever artists happened to be in them. A Hard Day's Night just kind of flipped that. They took what was a toss-off form, the rock movie, and made it something great.
Directed by American Richard Lester, the film created an entirely new language for rock and roll cinema. Previously, musicians had all made their transition to the big screen, playing fictional characters created by screenwriters. In A Hard Day's Night, however, the Beatles played themselves in a comedy inspired by their own experiences of fame. It was both a commercial and a critical phenomenon.
They're playing themselves in a sort of a fictional film. That didn't happen. So much of what happened in the early career of the Beatles hadn't really happened before. They were breaking through on so many different levels.
Tell me, how did you find America?
Turn left to Greenland.
Has success changed your life?
Yes.
I'd like to keep Britain tidy.
Are you a mod or a rocker?
No, I'm a mocker.
Oh. Have you any hobbies?
As I see it, it's really A Hard Day's Night that establishes them as something completely new and interesting beyond your wildest imaginings.
I don't snore. You do, repeatedly. Do I snore, John? Yeah, you're a window rattler, son. It's just your opinion. Do I snore, Paul?
With a trombone hooter like yours, it would be unnatural if you didn't.
No, Paulie, don't mock the afflicted.
Oh, come off it. It's only a joke.
It may be a joke, but it's his nose. He can't help having a hideous great hooter. And the poor little head trembling under the weight of it.
This was not the rock and roll movie that you were expecting to see, not at all. And although their wit had always been clear, they were always funny on the microphone, its irreverence, and its irreverence about themselves, was just completely unprecedented. And of course, it just made them seem even more godlike.
And while the Beatles embarked on a substantial US tour in the summer of '64, back in Britain, the whole country was evolving in their wake. Following the sex scandals of the previous year, the nation had turned against the establishment and voted in the Labour government of new Prime Minister Harold Wilson, a man who seemed to represent the voice of a younger, more progressive United Kingdom.
Harold Wilson actually became leader of the Labour Party around the same time that the Beatles were just having the first stirrings of huge success. He was Northern, let's not forget that. So this was, again, part of this big Northern powerhouse. You had the Beatles on the popular culture sense, and then you had Harold Wilson, who was reflecting modernity in the political sense. We're thrusting into a new world. We were behind Europe in the 50s. The Tories had let us down. He wanted to, let's get modern, like the Italians, like the French, like the Germans, let's get working. And let's make everyone enjoy the fruits of the success.
And central to this new progressive Britain was its youth. The staggering international success of the homegrown pop scene had injected the younger generation with confidence. And boosted by the country's growing prosperity, a new consumer culture emerged. Fresh from the breeding grounds of the art colleges, the modern ideas of Britain's budding designers were unleashed. This was nowhere more apparent than in fashion and its nerve centre in London's bustling Carnaby Street.
This was the first time that young people had enough money to buy records, to buy clothes, to have their haircuts. Out of that, almost immediately came a separate youth market. Carnaby Street thrived. Up until that point, when a girl left school, she immediately began dressing like her mother, whereas someone like Mary Quant made dresses that you could run in and you could dance in and do stuff that young people do. And of course, that transformed the whole face of British fashion.
Everything felt modern, new, fresh. Everywhere you looked, the world started to look different. The black and white of the early Beatles and pre-Beatles, even with the Beatles all in black and white, even Hard Day's Night was in black and white. Within a year, the colours started to really emerge, the green shoots of a new culture.
Although they had played the central role in cultivating this new cultural landscape, by late 1964, the Beatles themselves were growing weary of their 8-days-a-week fame. In an attempt to escape from Beatlemania, both John Lennon and George Harrison had moved to rural Surrey, 30 miles from the centre of London, and Ringo Starr would join them there the following year. In December, Beatles for Sale, the band's 4th studio album, was released, and it clearly showed signs of fatigue.
You only have to look at the cover. These are young men exhausted, really, by a couple of years of Beatlemania. It was just obvious that they were becoming worn out, and that the incredible appeal of early fame, which they just rode that like a wonderful wave, and you can see and feel the joy in the records and in the interviews. By Beatles for Sale, it's losing its luster quite quickly.
Yet the onward march of youth culture would soon revive the band. While the kaleidoscopic colours of Carnaby Street were in full bloom, a more experimental subculture was developing in West London, the leaders of which would soon cross paths with the Beatles. Inspired by avant-garde literature, art and music, this loose group of artists and artisans lacked a sense of community. In June 1965, however, Barry Miles, the manager of renowned independent bookshop Better Books, arranged a momentous poetry event at London's Albert Hall, featuring Allen Ginsberg and other leading American beat writers. It was of huge significance, uniting the various creative clans of an emerging British counterculture.
The big poetry reading at the Albert Hall in '65 was, I think, the first time a constituency was seen in London. Up until that point, the actors and the poets and the filmmakers and the people who ran boutiques, none of them knew each other. At this event, which was basically a Beat Generation reading of Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Gregory Corso, all of these people came together into the Albert Hall, 7,000 people. The whole thing was a giant party, and it was really like the first sort of mass networking session, I suppose.
At this pivotal event that he had helped organise, Miles met John Dunbar, an artist friendly with both Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso, and who had recently married young singer Marianne Faithfull. Together, they planned a new centre for underground activities, the Indica Bookshop and Gallery, and this would bring Miles directly into the Beatles' world.
We went along to the Albert Hall, and a friend called Paolo Leone kind of went, "Oh, you should meet this guy," who Miles worked at Better Books at that point. And so we got chatting, and I don't know how many people it holds, the Albert Hall, a couple of thousand, 5,000, I don't know. Anyway, we kind of thought, well, look, everybody's paid a quid to see this, so maybe we could do a shop.
We decided to combine forces and start a bookshop art gallery combined. His best friend was a guy called Peter Asher, who at that point was in Peter and Gordon, a little rock and folk duo who had #1 hits, in fact, in Britain and America and Japan. And so Peter had some money, so naturally we looked to Peter to finance this venture. And so consequently, we started a company called Miles, Asher and Dunbar, MAD. I got to know Peter, of course, through this. And he was living at home with his parents. And also living at home was his sister, Jane Asher. Jane was a TV personality. She interviewed people. She was a child star in films and a lot on the radio. Also living there was Jane Asher's boyfriend, who was Paul McCartney, who was living on the top floor in a little attic room next to Peter's room. So there was this extraordinary household that I got introduced to. And when I was setting up the bookshop, we had all the books delivered to the basement there because we hadn't found any premises yet. And obviously through that, I got to know Paul as well. He would come in late at night, browse through the books and just leave me a note saying what he'd taken. So he was my first customer, in fact, in the bookshop. And when we did find some premises, he helped put up the shelves and paint the walls. So he was very, very involved with the whole project. And it was wonderful to get to know him.
While his bandmates had fled London in favour of the quiet suburban life, through his contact with the progressive art world, Paul McCartney soon became the most cultured of the Beatles. Where John Lennon had been married for years and was raising a young son, George Harrison had moved in with girlfriend Pattie Boyd, and Ringo Starr was a newlywed, McCartney was actively pursuing fresh sounds and fresh concepts, with Miles as his avant-garde guide.
In his own words, he used to go around London with his antenna out. One day he would go to see you know, a John Cage concert or a Luciano Berio or some, you know, electronic music. And then next day he would go and see Tessie O'Shea at the Talk of the Town, and then, or some torch singer down at the Blue Angel. I mean, it was all being sucked in.
McCartney was very much the culturally aware Beatle about town, while the others went into a slightly cozier existence in the stockbroker belt. He was still curious, he was still hungry for any stimulation. It's around this time, 1965, 66, that McCartney really begins to drive the Beatles. He hung around in London, being stimulated, and bringing all of that back to the Beatles table and giving them, continuing to give them, an artistic edge.
That artistic edge would prove unmistakable when the Beatles headed to the studio in mid-1965 to record the album Rubber Soul. Across the previous year, the wave of bands inspired by the Beatles' example had not only begun to catch up with the Liverpudlians, but in some cases threatened to overtake them. Following Lennon and McCartney's lead, the Rolling Stones had managed to break America and had begun to write their own hits. Folk icon Bob Dylan had gone electric and transformed into the preeminent poet of rock. And new bands were emerging, from The Who to The Byrds, introducing fresh sounds and perspectives. Yet the Beatles were ready to pave the way once again. In pursuit of total creative control, with Rubber Soul, producer George Martin booked the band into Abbey Road Studios for an entire month, turning conventional recording rules on their head.
Before Rubber Soul, a professional recording day was overseen by recording engineers in white coats, and there was 3 hours in the morning, a break for lunch, and 3 hours in the afternoon, and that was it. That was your recording day. When Rubber Soul came along, they had enough clout to say, we want a bit more flexibility than that. We might want to stay on and record into the night.
They invented the idea of treating a record album as if it were a work of art. It takes time to do anything that's worthwhile. So you had this new idea, the idea of the recording studio as compositional laboratory. This was this incredible, real revolution, not just how to make records, but how to make music.
There are places I remember.
Rubber Soul looks like the moment when pop music could become popular art. The whole album had a sense of being an artistic statement. Brian Wilson himself of the Beach Boys said, when I heard Rubber Soul, I knew that's how good pop records could be. They could be a whole artistic world. That's how good Rubber Soul was.
Is there anybody going to listen to my story? All about the girl who came to stay. She's the kind of girl you want so much it makes you sorry. Still you don't regret a single day. Ah, girl, girl.
John Lennon is suddenly writing lyrics like, was she told when she was young that pain would lead to pleasure? Did she understand it when they said that a man must break his back to earn his day of leisure? Will she still believe it when he's dead? I mean, that's in a song called Girl. Those aren't pop song lyrics. That gave Rubber Soul just a very different feel.
Say the word and you'll be free. Say the word and be like me. Say the word I'm thinking of. Have you heard the word is love?
You could hear that they were actually writing songs as artists, not just as pop performers. So you had songs like The Word, which is an extraordinary song for 1965. Say the word and that word is love. You know, this is 2 years before The Summer of Love. The despair of Beatles for sale, and there they are now reaching out for something that they've picked up on something else.
And just as Rubber Soul re-established the band's musical superiority, the four young Northern radicals were officially recognized by the British establishment. Having already received the highest accolades from the entertainment world, in October 1965, they were invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. Here they would be anointed as members of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or MBEs.
This has been one of the talents of the establishment for a very long time. In fact, this is what the MBEs and knighthoods and all sorts of things like that were all about. That at a certain point, renegades need to be brought into the fold. But it's at that very moment that they now, because they were always importing musical influences, but they also become a conduit for imported American influences in these other fields that they're getting interested in. Miles is turning them on to Ginsberg's poetry. Robert Fraser is turning them on to American pop artists, things like this. They've become citizens of the world. And so it's perfectly appropriate that at that very moment, the British establishment should say, time for you to come to Buckingham Palace and be certified as representatives, as members of the British Empire.
John, had you met the Queen before?
No, first time.
What did she think of you in the flesh? Did she tell you?
No, she's not going to say either way, but she seemed pleasant enough to us, made us relaxed.
Oh, now you've got this, do you feel that you're becoming part of the establishment, as it's so called?
No, don't feel any different. I still feel just like before.
You feel exactly the same. You feel exactly the same.
It was a recognition that the pop world had come of age. They were the aristocracy of the pop world, of pop culture, of working class culture. And so it was sort of inevitable in a way that they would be rewarded in the spirit of the new sort of democracy. But also it closed a chapter because from then on, they went off and did it their way, which wasn't the establishment's way. In fact, it was the beginning of a period of great antagonism with the establishment and pop culture. And the Beatles, as usual, were pretty much at the center of that.
The Beatles' position at the center of these new developments in youth culture was crucial to their evolution over the next 2 years. With McCartney now closely affiliated with key players in London's underground artistic scene, and with similar movements in both New York and Los Angeles influencing American musicians, the stage was now set for more radical ideas to enter the mainstream. And as these were developing, a new drug and a new figurehead were gaining prominence on both sides of the Atlantic.
The message is very simple. 6 words. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Psychologist Timothy Leary had emerged in the US as a prominent spokesman for the hallucinogen LSD, or acid. Having led psychedelic experiments at Harvard University since the turn of the 60s, and with beat poet Allen Ginsberg a key early supporter, by 1965, Leary was becoming a major countercultural figure.
Tim Leary was a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, psychotherapist. He claimed, I think, to have something like 7 PhDs. He was a professor at Harvard who began working originally with psilocybin before he got onto LSD as a way of treating prisoners and treating mental illness. I mean, the thing is, Leary was very much part of the establishment. He'd worked right across the normal lines of psychiatry. But of course, when he started to take all these things, he contacted his own self on a cellular level, and he realized that an awful lot of this was game playing and rubbish. And so he basically felt that this was in fact a spiritual key that he'd been handed, and that his message really should be to encourage people to leave the establishment and find themselves creatively or spiritually.
And the newly appointed MBEs, the Beatles, were already on their way to leaving the establishment and rediscovering themselves through hallucinogens. John Lennon and George Harrison had been introduced to LSD in early 1965 and had been joined by Ringo Starr for their second experience with the drug later that year. Combined with Paul McCartney's newfound interest in experimental art through his London social circle, the world's most commercial band were ready to take a very unexpected detour.
They wanted to discover who they were. They had no real sense of who they were, I think, anymore. So they're picking up the pieces, putting it together again. How the hell did they make sense of the Goldfish Bowl life that they'd been thrown into? From playing at the Casbah in Liverpool and the Cavern to being feted all around the world and just seeing themselves reflected back people getting pieces of them everywhere, not knowing really who they were. And I think that was the engagement of pop culture, represented by the Beatles, with the counterculture, which was growing in confidence, and the fact that the two started to join forces in London, in San Francisco, they sparked off each other.
And it was at the close of 1965 that McCartney drew the ever-skeptical Lennon out of his Surrey sanctuary and introduced him to the underground world of Miles and the Indica bookshop and gallery.
One day, very shortly after we opened, Paul McCartney showed up with John Lennon, and I think it was the first time John was ever in the shop. And he was looking for a book by Nietzsche, and I just did not know who he meant. It took me maybe half a minute to figure out it was Nietzsche, and that was just enough time for him to get quite irritated and think I was being this middle-class university type, putting him down. And then Paul had to do his usual role of sort of calming everyone and said, no, he went to art school just like you, and it's just because you didn't know how to say it, did you, you know? But in the meantime, I remembered we had only just the day before had a big shipment of The Psychedelic Experience by Tim Leary. John curled up on the settee with it, and literally in Tim Leary's introduction, before you even get to the text, it says, turn off your mind and relax and drift downstream, or however the lines are, that finally showed up in only about a month later in Tomorrow Never Knows.
This song would be the most innovative composition of the band's career to date. Alongside Lennon's Leary-inspired lyrics, Paul McCartney's contributions to the track were equally radical. Having joined Miles at a number of avant-garde electronic music events, the Beatle had begun enthusiastically working on his own experimental compositions, using loops of recorded tape. As the Beatles entered the studio to begin producing Tomorrow Never Knows, George Martin invited McCartney to bring these to the sessions.
He had produced a whole load of them and brought them into the studio just in a plastic bag. They arranged the studio so that there were different tape recorders in different parts of the Abbey Road studio complex. And I was in a room with Peter Asher, and we were playing quite a long loop, which entailed holding a jam jar, and the loop went around the jam jar and then past the playback head and then over to, we had to keep it in tension. And I think there were 8 or maybe even 10 of us around the building, all standing, holding pencils or jam jars, and all of this information was going into the deck. And George Martin was just sitting there with his headphones, and whatever he did, of course, it's impossible to ever reproduce. That was it, that was the master, as soon as he pressed record. When I heard the playback, I mean, it was astonishing, actually. I thought, good God, you know, this is the future.
The studio was an instrument. Once upon a time, it was just this almost invisible console that was just there to absorb what was being played on the floor. Now it was actually being used as an instrument, and it was more important than individual instruments in a way. This was unprecedented. And the other interesting thing about Tomorrow Never Knows, it was the first recording for Revolver. It was done in April '66. I mean, this is extraordinary. Tomorrow Never Knows is undoubtedly the most psychedelic song recorded at that period. There's nothing else like it. I mean, the word psychedelic wasn't really in popular parlance at all. It was the title of a book that John got from Indica Gallery.
Tomorrow Never Knows is definitely the world's first psychedelic track. The interesting thing is, of course, the Beatles were not only the world's most commercial band, but at that point they were also the world's most experimental band, which is very unusual.
That became clear when the Beatles' follow-up to Rubber Soul, Revolver, was issued in August 1966. Alongside Tomorrow Never Knows, the album's tracks were brimming with invention and originality. If Rubber Soul had suggested that pop music could be art, Revolver confirmed it.
Revolver really was the Beatles moving towards the fifth dimension. She said, I know what it's like to be dead. The Beatles, Lennon singing about, I know what it's like to be dead. What the hell is going on? Well, they'd been partying with Birds in the West Coast and dropping acid by then. Drugs, we have a very negative view on them now in that you can be imprisoned by them. But in the mid-60s, I think, people felt it was the opposite. It was to loosen the chains of imprisonment, this single view of who you were. And then suddenly you had perspectives. And Revolver, you can hear it with all the different production sounds. It was all altered states and perspectives.
The idea was basically to turn rock and roll into a legitimate art form, and I think they did it. So many of the things they tried, from feedback and reverse tapes and sitars, whatever they did, all over the world, other bands immediately tried out. I mean, they were tremendous leaders. Brian Epstein was concerned that they were going too far ahead of their fan base. But they were very, very sensible like that. They always wanted to bring the fans along with them. They didn't want to become some kind of wild avant-garde band that only 150 people heard of.
Epstein's fears that the band would start to lose some of their audience were unfounded regarding their musical output, but would prove accurate in terms of their politics. With the Beatles' compositions expressing a more complex worldview, journalists began to ask them more significant questions. In a series of landmark interviews for British newspaper The Evening Standard, the individual band members were quizzed over their thoughts on current affairs. Lennon's frank opinions on Christianity proved uncontroversial upon their publication in Britain, yet when they were reprinted in America, the first scandal of the Beatles' career erupted, with a single quote becoming instantly infamous. "We're more popular than Jesus now."
First time anybody had asked John Lennon questions about his life and his philosophy, and it just passed without. But months later, one of those teenage magazines just printed that "We're bigger than Jesus," which caused a lot of problems. A lot of problems. Death threats and records being burnt and broken and smashed, and the Ku Klux Klan and concerts being cancelled. And it was very unpleasant for everyone.
Well, originally I was pointing out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact.
Lennon's, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus line, which even to me as a kid, I could see what he was saying. He wasn't saying, it's what he said in his quote unquote apology. Like, I wasn't saying we're better than Jesus. I wasn't saying it's good or it's bad. It's just it's true. And to me, it was absolutely true. It was unquestionable. There was such a backlash against them. It made you aware of some of the fault lines in American culture, or made you aware once again that what seemed maybe like a unified culture really wasn't. And it was harsh. It was scary.
These fault lines in American society had been growing since the early 1960s, and where the civil rights campaigns for racial equality had most clearly exposed these divisions earlier in the decade, by the mid-1960s there was no issue more pressing or more polarizing than the Vietnam War. Since the US entered into the conflict in 1962, it had provoked widespread public opposition and organized protests both in the US and across Europe. The underground movement McCartney had become involved in had itself emerged from the early 60s pacifist movement in the UK, and by the time of their 1966 US tour, privately both he and his bandmates were opponents of the war. As they traveled across America, already battling controversy, the ever-honest Liverpudlians came under fire once again when they made this position absolutely clear to the press.
In 1966, the war was without any question much more on people's minds in America than the Beatles. 1966 was the year the war exploded. 1966 was the year that the number of draftees more than doubled in this country. 1966 was also the year in which the war really got terrible in Vietnam itself. It wasn't just, it was a bigger deal all the time. There was more destruction going on.
At the height of American involvement in Vietnam, they had 550,000 troops in that country. That's a lot of young people. There was a draft in the United States. The war had come home in a big way. It wasn't an abstract issue in any regard. And youth representatives, like the Beatles, people who were part of youth culture were expected to take a stand on it.
It seems to me you've always been successful because you've been outspoken direct and forthright and all this sort of thing. Does it seem a bit hard to you that people are now knocking you for this very thing?
Yes, Richard. It seems very hard. It seems hard, you know, free speech.
But is it possible just to say what you think all the time? What about 14-year-old teenagers who think you're absolutely marvellous and can't bear to be heard?
See, we're not, when we say anything like that, we don't say it older people seem to think to be offensive. We mean it helpfully, you know, and if it's wrong, what we say, okay, it's wrong, and people can say, you know, you're wrong about that one. But in many cases, we believe it's right, you know, we're quite serious about it.
But do you mind being asked questions? For example, in America, people keep asking you questions about Vietnam. Does this seem useful?
Well, I don't know, you know, if you can say that war's no good and a few people believe you, then it may be good, I don't know. You can't say it too much, though, that's the trouble.
It seems a bit silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
They were the first band to be asked about politics, about Vietnam, about all number of social issues. And in fact, I mean, although Dylan came a little bit before, as far as I know, he never once ever came out in public against the Vietnam War. So maybe the Beatles were the first there in terms of a very well-known band.
Well, it cost them a lot. There were then teenage girls in the South and the Midwest who didn't like the Beatles anymore.
I think the Beatles are a real talented group, but I think that they need to watch what they say because they're in such a position that a lot of teenagers really think of them as something really big, and when they say things like that, some teenagers are going to just believe anything they say.
In 1965, the Beatles were universally beloved. Nobody didn't like them. They were just wonderful and funny and creative and unthreatening. As they became more involved in the counterculture and more representative of it, they lost a lot of that belovedness. They helped to move a lot of people who might not otherwise have gone along with the stuff that happened in 66 and 67 and 68. Without any question, they were inspirational and influential in that way, but they also lost a lot of people. They became part of what many people in America, probably a majority of people in America, regarded as a disturbing loosening of values and morals and a political threat.
And at exactly this point, the Beatles ceased operating as a traditional band. Upon their return from the US, they announced that they were abandoning live performance, with the final show of the American tour their last ever paid gig. And then the most photographed celebrities in the world simply disappeared from the public eye altogether.
Hey, can I have a word? Are the Beatles going to go their own ways in 1967?
They could be, you know, on our own or together. We're always involved with each other, whatever we're doing.
Could you ever see a time when, in fact, you weren't working together?
I could see us working not together for a period, but we'd always get together for one reason or other. Like, I mean, you need other people for ideas as well, but, you know, and we all get along fine.
Will you
Rumours of a breakup began to circulate. Yet, away from the spotlight, the four Liverpudlians were hard at work on their most ambitious production to date. The public would have to wait for months before the Beatles reappeared. And when in February 1967 they finally did, both their image and their sound had undergone a startling transformation.
Strawberry Fields, of course, was originally intended as part of the Sgt. Pepper sessions. But the press kept on saying, you know, are the Beatles finished? They've disappeared, you know, they've run out of ideas, not realizing, of course, that they were working on one of their greatest achievements. And to me, obviously, it wasn't unexpected because I was at some of the sessions. But I think to the public, it came as quite a shock.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields.
Strawberry Fields Forever was something else again. It was the Beatles had gone weird. I mean, that was basically what people felt. What is wrong with them? That's, let me take you down, so I'm going to Strawberry Fields. And the voice, it didn't sound like Lennon. Well, that's because they'd slowed the voice down. Nothing sounded normal on that record. The whole production, everything was kind of up in the air, put through effects. And then there was a video that was made at the time as well, shot in Sevenoaks or somewhere. And it was the strangest thing. You had Ringo as if he was disembodied. They were falling out of trees. There was nothing like that at all.
Living is easy with eyes closed. Misunderstanding all you see. It's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me.
It had more in common with Salvador Dali and the Surrealists and Dada, all these highfalutin art kind of ideas, which was once the preserve really mainly of the educated elite. But this is the Beatles now bringing it to everybody.
This short film for Strawberry Fields had a seismic impact because it showed that they had traveled a distance that, well, you know, I felt it kind of incumbent on me to then travel as a young person who believed in that. It was like, wow, okay, this is what's being asked of me now. You know, it wasn't just, oh, that's, you know, they look cool. It was, all right, this is the path.
And that path became even clearer as the year progressed. By the turn of 1967, the counterculture was gaining momentum, with huge numbers of youths gravitating towards its new mecca, San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. From here, a strong musical scene was developing, headed by psychedelic bands the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane, and word spread of a new phenomenon, the hippie. In the UK, the underground's influence expanded, with its own newspaper, the International Times, a live music club, UFO, and emerging stars the Pink Floyd and the American Jimi Hendrix. Into this blooming scene of peace, love, and mind-expanding drugs came the Beatles' most ambitious work to date, one which would not only capture the essence of this new sensibility, but also transform the record industry once again. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Presented as a work of art, with a single concept unifying the album as a whole, it announced that the age of the traditional pop single and the pop band was over.
Sgt. Pepper revolutionized the record industry. All of a sudden, albums sold as much as singles. Sgt. Pepper sold in the millions. On pure business terms, it was a revolutionary release. But also it was revolutionary in terms of letting the record industry know precisely what it could sell. What you could do is invest in the finest artistic minds of a generation and give them the freedom to make their art, package it up as an album, and sell it in the millions.
Paul had this idea of, we want to get away from being the four Mop Tops and the Fab Four, so we create this new name for ourselves. We're going to be a different group, and that'll give us the freedom to do what the hell we want. That is the basic concept. The songs, many of those songs could have been on any of the other albums. It didn't really, you know, they weren't specific to that particular one. But the influence of it was staggering. The Beatles were a force to be reckoned with. I mean, even the Stones were badly affected by them at that point. Everyone just had to deal with them. They were like a roadblock. You know, if you were in the music business, you just had to deal with this great big thing in front of you and get around it the best you could.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, the title itself was a piece of art and something that mystified people. Peter Blake did the cover, and Peter Blake was the father of British pop art. Everything about Sgt. Pepper was an enigma. The fact that they were pretending to not be the Beatles, but to be another band. The lock groove at the end of side 2, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD, secret messages all the way through. It was like a work of literature, you know, it's like a Ulysses or something where people were just thinking, I don't quite understand this, but there's definitely something really going on.
This combination of imagination and mystery proved irresistible. With Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles transformed from pop culture icons into mystics of the modern age.
When the Beatles came out with a new song, people started pondering it. These are people that you're looking to for meaning
By '67, I think the release of Sgt. Pepper in America established the Beatles basically as the leaders of the counterculture, along with a few other people like Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary. But the Beatles were the musical leaders right across the board. I mean, they were seen as, yes, as gods. I mean, Leary himself said a lot of silly things about them as a type of new superheroes, you know, leaders of men and all this stuff.
I'm not convinced that the youth culture in the mid-60s were terribly aware of LSD and Timothy Leary and even counterculture attitudes. If it hadn't have been for that conduit that was the Beatles, this sort of stuff might have just stayed in San Francisco, in California. The counterculture wasn't called the underground for no reason. Not many people knew about it.
Yet the Beatles were determined to spread the word even further. At the end of June 1967, less than a month after the release of Sgt. Pepper's, the band were invited to represent Britain in the first ever international satellite television broadcast. Across the US, Canada, and Europe, the youthful optimism of the counterculture was reaching its peak during the Summer of Love, with thousands flocking to large public events. With their historic contribution to the One World broadcast, the Beatles delivered the scene's definitive anthem to an audience of over 500 million viewers worldwide.
The Beatles, true to form, national representatives representing their country, they start with the national anthem. The only problem is, it's the French national anthem. You know, I mean, that's a classic. That is total Beatle humor.
It was fun. I was at that one. It was like a party. They'd invited a load of their friends, you know, the Small Faces and the Rolling Stones, and everybody was there, all in our psychedelic finery. Sitting on the floor there, it just looked like it might all explode at some point. But and there was an awful lot of sort of frantic waving and people rushing around, holding onto their headphones and talking to people. That was mostly to do with the international link-up, though, because no one had ever done that before. It really did go out live all around the world. It was fantastic.
This is mere weeks after the release of Sgt. Pepper. Every other band would choose to use that moment to promote Sgt. Pepper by doing a couple of tracks from it, right? It just makes total business sense. But they took the opportunity to send a message to the world that all you need is love. They'd already been saying it on Rubber Soul, the word is love, but this was the time they could tell the whole world all at the same time. The Beatles are clearly leading the way. I think there's a great significance in the idea of them sitting on those high chairs with the beautiful people of London, including Mick Jagger, sitting at their feet, looking up at them and singing along to a song they've only just heard. You know, that's powerful.
All You Need Is Love was an anthem of hope from a youth movement certain that the old order was about to crumble. The Beatles were steering an entire generation into uncharted territory. Yet it would not take the establishment long to respond to these peaceful revolutionaries. In the UK, the police were mobilized and began to make a number of drug busts, arresting not only prominent figures on the underground scene, but also Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and later Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. These high-profile cases didn't faze Paul McCartney, however. Following the arrests, he not only paid for, but also put his name to a national press advert calling for the legalization of marijuana. Weeks later, he admitted to a journalist that he had taken LSD and repeated this in a television interview, much to the shock of Brian Epstein.
Brian didn't like things being made public, you know. He was a very private person, you know, obviously because of his way of life. The thing is about drugs, it wasn't anything about them being good or bad. It was illegal.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
4 times.
And where did you get it from?
So, you know, I mean, if I was to say where I got it from, you know, it's illegal and everything, it's silly to say that.
Don't you believe that this was a matter which you should have kept private?
But the thing is, you know, that I was asked a question by a newspaper. And the decision was whether to tell a lie or to tell him the truth, you know. I decided to tell him the truth. But I really didn't want to say anything, you know, because if I'd had my decision, you know, if I had it my way, I wouldn't have told anyone, you know, because I'm not trying to spread the word about this. But the man from the newspaper is the man from the mass medium, you know. I'll keep it a personal thing. If he does too, you know, if he keeps it quiet. But he wanted to spread it, so it's his responsibility, you know, for spreading it, not mine.
The thing is, Paul is always honest. If a reporter asked him, have you taken LSD, he's going to say yes. He wouldn't lie. Why should he? If they're going to ask that question, they get an honest answer. It was a risky thing for him to say, and I probably gave Brian Epstein a conniption. But basically, although the Beatles had made a lot of money, they were never really in it for the money. Once they had enough to really live well, that was it. I think that was a very good sign of them, that they paid their tax and they said what they wanted.
The Beatles' sense of security was about to be challenged, however. In late August, the band was shocked to receive the news that their manager, Brian Epstein, had died. Their most trusted accomplice. In his absence, they were suddenly left without his stabilizing influence. At the same time, their quest for personal and spiritual growth continued. George Harrison had become fascinated by Indian music in 1965, and as he immersed himself in its techniques, he became increasingly drawn to its spiritual foundations. This led him to discover the Indian guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and his technique of transcendental meditation. By mid-1967, Harrison was introducing his bandmates to the Maharishi's ideas, and soon the Beatles had a new spiritual advisor.
When they first got involved with him, I wrote and asked Allen Ginsberg what the story was on the Maharishi in India, because Ginsberg had lived there for a number of years, and he knew a lot of the gurus and the teachers and everything. And he wrote back saying that the Maharishi was very commercial and that he was under a lot of criticism in India for taking disciples' money, because in fact the teaching should be free. So I reported this to John Lennon, who came out with a wonderful line of, "Ain't no ethnic bastard gonna get any golden castles out of me."
Despite his initial reservations, in February 1968, Lennon and his bandmates traveled to India for an extended retreat with the guru. Joined by their various wives and girlfriends, their departure to the East for spiritual fulfillment made headlines worldwide. The press swarmed around the perimeter of the Maharishi's 14-acre compound, both intrigued and baffled by this latest chapter in the Beatles' unpredictable journey. This exposure brought Eastern religion to the attention of an enormous audience.
Sometime in January, it was suddenly like, right, we're off to Maharishi and we're living in a holiday camp in India. You know, oh, right, have a good time, you know. But they did write a heck of a lot of songs while they were there, you know, churning them out.
The Beatles introduced the world, especially the young world, to things that they would never have stumbled upon had the Beatles not been there. The philosophy behind transcendental meditation, Buddhism, they were looking outwards. Meditation was at the center of it. That's actually really all that matters. It's the soul. The reality is here. Not many people have really thought about that before. And if the Beatles, the most popular band in the world, the most popular cultural phenomenon in the world, were talking earnestly about this stuff, obviously, as much as a lot of the elders might laugh, at least as many young people went along with them. And, you know, sales of texts of Eastern wisdom, they went through the roof in the late 60s. People flocked to see the Maharishi. The Beatles were this gateway to a kind of another world.
Although the band emerged from India both spiritually and creatively refreshed, this sense of calm would be short-lived. In February 1968, they set up their own corporation, Apple. This multifaceted company was developed to broaden the Beatles' activities and to retain full control over their output. Yet it would prove the first of many overambitious projects for the band. And as they entered the studio in the summer to work on their follow-up to Sgt. Pepper, for the first time, creative and personal disputes crept into the recording sessions. A particular source of tension was the daily presence of an outsider in the Beatles' inner sanctum, the conceptual artist Yoko Ono, with whom John Lennon had fallen deeply in love. It was a relationship that had been blossoming in private for more than a year. While McCartney had been growing in confidence through his underground activities, Lennon's sense of isolation in rural Surrey had increased. Initially finding a release through LSD, it was Yoko Ono who offered him a means of escape. A relatively unknown artist when she had travelled to London with husband Tony Cox in 1966, it was through the Indica Gallery that she came into contact with Lennon. Its owner, John Dunbar, provided the space for Ono's first UK exhibition, and it was he who invited his Beatle friend to attend this unusual show.
She was plainly a kind of interesting, powerful woman. I didn't show ordinary, pictures on the wall at all, really. And so, she had some good ideas, and I liked them. She wanted to do a show, so we managed to find a couple of weeks where we didn't have something on. Yoko was reluctant to have anybody look at it until she totally finished everything, and labelled everything and everything. And so we were sort of doing that. But me and Tony had to sort of tell her that, look, this guy might buy something, you never know. He came round and he did like the ladder, and then, I've been looking through the magnifying glass and it says yes, so he liked that.
The relationship that developed across the following 2 years would be consummated in May 1968, just before the Beatles began work on the White Album. Lennon emerged a changed man, released from an unhappy marriage and liberated as an artist.
The arrival of Yoko Ono into John's life transformed Lennon completely. She was the mother, lover, teacher. She was kind of everything, really, to John. He needed that.
When he met Yoko, she was basically a mother figure. I mean, he used to call her mother. She, for her own reasons, took him on and saved him, actually.
As Ono's presence made an impact on both Lennon and the bond between the Beatles, the world outside of the band began to darken. As the war in Vietnam spiraled further out of control, and with no apparent end to the conflict in sight, across the West, the cultural movement so inspired by the Beatles no longer believed love is all you need. The progressive, liberal core of the counterculture came under fire, with the assassinations of first civil rights leader Martin Luther King and then presidential candidate Robert Kennedy increasing tensions. Both in the US and Britain, once peaceful anti-war demonstrations descended into violence. Student riots brought Paris to a standstill, and images of street skirmishes and police brutality became commonplace. As the authorities led an unforgiving onslaught on the counterculture, revolution replaced love as the new objective.
In '68, it all exploded. You had assassinations in the States, the threat of civil war, riots at the Democratic Convention, riots in Paris, in London, violence on the streets. Actually, there was a sort of a fight. Power, you don't really get power. It won't trickle down. It has to be sort of forced. And if you look at history, that tends to be the case. The Beatles' revolution was a benign one through art and love. But by '68, the bricks were flying all over the place.
It wasn't just the kind of sweet utopianism of the Summer of Love, but really days of rage. The demonstrations at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, was a kind of dividing line. You saw the police out there like clubbing kids, and there really was a sense of, we're kind of at war now.
Just as this unrestrained police brutality tore through Chicago in August 1968, the Beatles issued the single Revolution, addressing the struggles of a youth culture under threat. Yet unlike All You Need Is Love the previous year, John Lennon's composition refused to express the voice of this disillusioned movement or to accept the call to arms of the radical left. For the first time, This saw the Beatles turned upon by their own peers. Yet Lennon's reluctance to commit to violence not only led to two different versions of the track, but also reflected the inner struggles that many young people were dealing with.
The song Revolution, there are two versions of it. Lennon goes back and forth on, don't you know that you can count me out in as far as revolution is concerned. You know, exactly where you were supposed to stand was difficult. All young people were feeling that. You know, go to a protest? Yeah, sure. Go to a protest that maybe occupies a building? Oh, maybe, you know, burning that building down? Do you draw the line there?
If you're talking about destruction, Lennon's saying, count me out, then he's saying, count me in. He doesn't know. He's on the fence. At that point, Lennon, as much as he could be a bit handy, was seduced by this idea of peace and love. He'd just written the anthem of the previous year.
There always was a kind of inherent optimism in the Beatles somehow, whereas that wasn't true of Dylan. It wasn't true of the Stones. It was almost like Martin Luther King. You know, people don't say this now, but there was a sense in which, you know, a lot of the black radicals who were emerging seemed more of the moment. Dr. King seemed like kind of part of the protest establishment. And in a certain way, the Beatles seemed a little bit like that too.
If the band were losing some of their relevance as a cultural force, through Yoko Ono's influence, John Lennon ensured that they remained musical pioneers. Where Revolution had pulled its punches politically, an experimental collage that he created with his new partner captured the chaos of 1968 simply through sound itself. When it was issued on the band's self-titled LP at the close of the year, the track Revolution 9 became the most widely heard avant-garde composition ever released. It was a startling statement from a man who had been heralding in the summer of love only a year beforehand.
He went from one extreme to the other. Lennon suddenly saw it's all gone wrong. He turned to the flip side, and the flip side was Revolution number 9, Revolution 9, which was a very, very different view of the future.
Number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9.
Revolution 9 was the sound really of not just the riots in Paris and on the streets of Chicago. This is the sound of the apocalypse. This is his incredibly honest depiction of the worst fear of all, which is a society and a world in sort of global turmoil. It's an extraordinary piece and one of the scariest pieces of music that you could ever hear. In the 21st century, Revolution 9 is far more relevant than it ever was, I think, in '68.
Having delivered the most extreme composition in the Beatles' catalogue, Lennon's further experimental activities continued outside of the band. By the end of 1968, the first of a trilogy of albums with Yoko Ono was issued, Two Virgins, with a cover depicting the couple naked. Still a member of the most popular and commercially successful act in the world, Lennon was now breaking every rule imaginable. Yet the anger in some quarters of the counterculture toward the song Revolution also led him into a greater political role. And in 1969, as Richard Nixon was sworn in as the new president of America, John Lennon and Yoko Ono emerged as the world's most prominent activists.
When Lennon came out and he said, if you're talking about destruction, count me out, he was terribly criticized by the hard left. And it seems to me that his reaction to that was not to change his mind about destruction, but actually to say, no, I really don't think the answer is destruction. I think the answer actually is peace.
In March 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were married. With their honeymoon, the couple embarked on a high-profile campaign for peace, presented as a series of conceptual art events. In the spirit of the Beatles' initial attitude to the press, the first of these took place in their hotel bridal suite, in which they invited journalists to discuss politics openly and frankly.
This is for the world peace, you see, and we're thinking that instead of going out and fight and make war or something like that, we should just stay in bed. Everybody should just stay in bed and enjoy the spring, you know.
He put his career right on the line there for his beliefs, and you have to applaud him for that, of course. It brought him an awful lot of harassment and trouble.
While you're in bed and you're giving your press conferences in pillowcases, are you laughing at us?
No, no.
It's no more than you're laughing at us, you know. I mean, we have a laugh. We think it's funny that the front page news should be the fact that two people went to bed on their honeymoon. We see the funny side of it. And that in Vienna, which is a pretty square place, there's all these beautiful photographs of microphones being held to a bag, you know, to wait for the bag to speak.
It's rather nice, you know.
But we're serious about the peace bit, you know.
Brave, foolhardy, they were all of that. But who else would have done that then? It would be front page news if they're in bed talking about peace. John didn't know necessarily the ins and outs of the whole Vietnam thing. He and Yoko knew that it was wrong to be dropping napalm on villages and stripping the skin off children. I mean, he wasn't wrong in that thinking. He really wasn't wrong.
As the couple's honeymoon moved from Europe to Canada, they were joined in their hotel room by Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, and a variety of counterculture figures to record an anthem for their campaign. And where their experimental records and their public appearances had left many confused, this song managed to bring their message to a global audience.
Give Peace a Chance was his attempt to do something in his own terms that was actually useful, and I think it proved to be so. He wrote an anthem. It's a simplistic anthem, but it's an anthem that has a good heart and a good message, and that people have been singing ever since.
He's moved further and further away from the elegant combination of artistic musical choices and resonant text into records that only have a message. He had that ability to distill something down to its bare essence, make it communicative, make it unforgettable, and it still resonates to this day.
While Lennon pressed on campaigning for peace, the close of the decade saw the first major casualties of the youth movement, with the death of Rolling Stone Brian Jones and permanent narcotics damage on both Beach Boy Brian Wilson and the Pink Floyd's Syd Barrett. The utopian vision of a brave new world was crumbling, and this was reflected within the Beatles camp itself. The tensions that had previously arisen in the studio now spread into the bandmates' own relationships with each other. And when McCartney married his new partner, Linda Eastman, in 1969, none of his fellow Beatles attended the ceremony. As the world moved into the 1970s, Paul issued his debut solo record along with a press release, which announced that he was quitting the band. It was official. The Beatles were no more. The demise of the band shocked their fans worldwide, yet those close to the musicians had watched them gradually drift apart over a 2-year period.
There was no cohesion. The old Liverpool bubble that they all used to live in and see each other all the time and love each other and be tolerant of each other's foibles and differences had gone. So now they were spinning off in different directions with new ideas, new families, new girlfriends, new children. It just wasn't working anymore. It was obvious, really, that the Beatles as a group had pretty much come to an end.
Has a multi-million-dollar entertainment act ever broken up because it wasn't fun anymore? Well, we know actually, because so many groups from that same period continued and continued and continued when it most definitely wasn't fun anymore. The Beatles ended it because the reasons that they had gotten into doing it ceased to have value for them. So they said, let's not do this anymore. That's as powerful a statement about their integrity and their intentions and their values as anything that I can think of.
In the Beatles' wake, youth culture became more divided. Rock music got heavier and more self-indulgent, and pop turned its attention to glamour. As for the band members themselves, despite Lennon's continued activism and string of hit singles, McCartney's mainstream triumph through his band Wings, and Harrison's successful emergence as an artist in his own right, their impact as individuals could never match that of their Beatles' glory days. Yet although their vision of utopia had failed to materialize, the world was still forever changed by the Beatles' innovations and the values that they represented. Even if no one has ever managed to compete with that impact, with every successive generation of musicians, the Beatles remain the benchmark for how popular entertainers can interact with the wider world.
Did the cultural and musical changes to which they were without any doubt the largest contributors have a permanent effect on how rock and roll conceived itself? Yeah, permanent effect on how rock and roll conceived itself. So that there's, even now, in this kind of glitzy pop era, pop stars see it as an option that they have to accept or refuse to be conscious, controversial, and some choose one and others really deny it, and some are extremely bland. But it's there on the table, always there on the table for everybody.
And as the band's astonishing achievements continue to make an impact half a century later, the legacy of the Beatles and of the remarkable decade in which they flourished remains unrivaled. The unique story of four working-class Liverpudlians who changed the world.
Lennon said something along the lines of, we weren't leaders in this world. We were just the guys on the mast saying, land ahoy. We were letting you know what we could see. And without the Beatles, understanding the 60s would have been a completely different experience.
They touched everything. The Beatles covered it all. If you want to know what the 60s are about, you listen to Beatles records. It tells you, the story is there.
This sounds like a cliche, but it's really impossible to overstate the Beatles' impact. It sounds like you're exaggerating, and to younger people who weren't there, you know, it just sounds ridiculous. You know, but it was true. You know, they changed everything.